Let's see if I can share my screen correctly. First, you're probably going to see my cat, if everything works the way it's supposed to. Let's see. Well, it's only showing one of my screens, so maybe if I do that, and then that, and then if I do that, yeah, that looks like that's working, I think, right?
Yep, looks good.
We can see your like notes.
Oh, you're seeing the notes?
Yeah.
That's not what you're supposed to be seeing. The other screen, which is weird. I don't know. Let's see. Maybe try that instead. Did that work?
Yes.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks for helping me out with that. Appreciate it. So yeah, thanks, Jillian, again. Thanks everybody for joining us today to talk about phenology. You may have seen my background earlier. It was kind of my local phenology mayor 8 weeks ago, which always amazes me how fast things can change around here. It seemed like we would never have spring, and then it comes on, and the wildflowers are blooming, and trees are leafing out and everything. It happens amazingly quickly, and that's of course all part of phenology, phenomenal phenology. Phenomenon and phenology, of course, both have the same beginning, because that's basically what phenology is. It's a natural phenomenon. And before I kind of get into phenology and how NETN has been monitoring it and how Kyle's helping the park do it as well, I do want to talk a little bit about the program that I work with. Some of you probably aren't familiar with it. As you can see in the top there, it's called the Inventory and Monitoring Program. It's actually a relatively new National Park Service program as far as those things go. It's early 2000s is really when this started. The whole idea being that the national parks, obviously, over 400 of them now, a lot of them protect and try to share with the public some amazing natural resources. And the whole idea was to keep them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And that's hard to do when you're not exactly sure what you have in your park. A lot of parks, just because of budgetary restrictions and not having enough staff and that kind of thing, it was difficult for them to figure out exactly what they had within their park. So that's why this program was dreamed up. That's the inventory part of this program, basically helping the parks understand the resources that they have. And then, of course, the monitoring part of the program is letting the parks know how those resources are doing over time. Essentially, as long as those are national parks, they will have the INM program helping them monitor the resources. That said, not all 420 odd national parks out there today have what we call significant natural resources. There's about 270 or so parks within the National Park Service that are part of this program. And it does go coast to coast, from Alaska to Hawaii, north, south, east, west. Basically, the country was broken up into these kind of eco-regional sections that shared similar natural resources and topography. So that's why doesn't actually follow like really set boundaries as it looks here. It's just the national parks that kind of fall within those areas are part of these networks. And conveniently enough, up here in the Northeast, we have what we call the Northeast Temperate Network, which essentially spans from Maine down to New Jersey, about 13 national parks within that, including, of course, where several of us are located today, which is in Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historical Park in central Vermont, essentially in Woodstock. And the way that the INM program works is that they decided to kind of, because it's impossible to monitor every single resource within a park, they decided to focus in on what they call vital signs, which are biological parts of park ecosystems that really help represent overall health and condition for all of the park resources. So a similar idea to when you go get a physical, the doctor generally doesn't, check out every single part of you. They check out things like your pulse and, other things like that to see if one of those things are off, and that gives them an idea to look into it further to see what the issues may be. And that's the same thing with the INM monitoring program. Things that we monitor, things like breeding birds, invasive species, air quality, visitor use impact in some of our parks that are very busy, water quality as well, and phenology too. All of those things obviously relate to each other. And if we did see something happening within the bird community, for example, or within the air quality, that means it's obviously something else is impacting that, and it gives good reason to look further into it. So that's why these are kind of these big umbrella ecological niches within each park. And all of these, of course, are deeply impacted and relate to climate. As climate changes, all of these things will be affected in their own ways, perhaps none more so than phenology itself. Phenology monitoring, kind of an obscure word for something that really is part of our everyday lives, even though you may not know it. You experience phenology basically every time you go outside. It provides a really easy way and method for tracking ecological response and change, which is why NETN and Northeast Shepherd Network made it one of our vital signs. But before I kind of define what phenology is, I'll define what phenology isn't. Some of you may have heard of kind of the pseudoscience called phrenology, which was a couple hundred to several hundred years ago. Considered a legit science for a little while. It was literally when so-called doctors would read the bumps and lumps on your head, and they'd be able to tell things like what your personality is and what it could be, and if you're going to be a criminal, and kind of all sorts of crazy stuff that they thought was part of kind of the map of your head, being able to understand what kind of person you were and were going to be. Amazingly enough, it isn't done anymore. They figured out it didn't work. Phenology, however, does work, and phenology itself really defined as the study of recurring plant and animal life cycle stages, like leafing out and flowering of plants, the maturation of agricultural crops, the emergence of insects, the migration of birds. All of these things, of course, are extremely sensitive to climatic variation and change. So, one of the reasons why not just national parks, but all sorts of people around the world are interested in seeing how things are changing as far as phenology goes. As I said, it's extremely linked to climate. The timing of most phenological events are linked to changes in weather or climate. Of course, leaves turn colors as temperatures cool in the fall. Animals emerge from hibernation as snow melts. Birds migrate northward as spring warms and south as winter sets in. And amphibians migrate and mate when the vernal pools thaw. So, these things are all large natural events, and all, of course, directly linked to climate and to changes in climate as well. The timing of these events can change, whether it's a cool or a warm year as well. Some birds will leave earlier in the fall if it's cold, and they'll arrive earlier in the spring if it's warmer. So the crucial kind of point here is that all species respond differently to changes in climate. Not all of them are going to respond the exact same way. Some respond dramatically, others less so, others really not at all, as far as we can tell. And it's not surprising that species do different things as far as relating to changes in temperature, but it has really important implications for ecological health of where we live. Phenology is basically kind of the key factor behind ecology. And it's really hard to think of any ecological relationship that doesn't rely on phenological events. For example, pollinators need flowers at the right time when they emerge, to get the nectar to feed themselves and their offspring. Predators need prey when they arrive back here. Of course, birds are a good example of that. Birds need the insects to eat to not only refuel their bodies, but of course to raise their young. Big reason why many bird species travel literally thousands of miles to come from South America to get up to the Northeast and other parts of North America to raise their young, because the insect population is so important and such a good source of protein to raise their chicks and their young. And even things like the amount of water that a tree transpires into the atmosphere depends on how long the leaves are on the tree. And that has effects on, of course, humidity levels too, and weather, day to day as well. So, for the longer the leaves are on the tree, the more humid a climate tends to be. I mean, of course, the extreme example of that is the rainforest, where leaves are almost constantly on the trees, and extremely humid atmosphere down in that area. What we don't want, and what we're starting to see more of, is what they call a phenological mismatch. And that is essentially when interacting species change the timing of regularly repeated phases and their life cycles at different rates. And an example of that is when organisms that typically interact, like predator and prey and plant and pollinator, are no longer active at the same time, meaning that, say, it's really warm in South America, and birds kind of think it's the signal, maybe just start coming up here early. However, we're having a cooler spring, and there's no insects when they arrive, not as many insects as they expect, which obviously would be a problem if you travel thousands of miles to get here and there's no food for you. Or bees might emerge early if it's warm, thinking that a lot of the wildflowers are blooming, but they haven't had a chance to do that yet because it wasn't the timing was off. So when that happens, obviously it can have big impacts on the overall health of these ecosystems. And phenology, as I was saying, it's really part of everyday life, even though we don't realize we're tracking phenology. We do all the time, just by observing what's happening outside when we go out there. Of course, as the leaves emerge on the trees, when birds arrive and butterflies, migrations happen as well too. We even time festivals around phenological events. Of course, up here in the Northeast, fall foliage is a huge part of the economy, and a huge phenological event as well. Even whale migration is tied into phenological events. There's festivals built around lupins and cherry blossoms, and of course all big and important parts of the economies of those regions as well. Phenology can even be linked to human health in many ways. Think about mosquitoes and black flies and ticks and allergies as well. These are all things that are tied to phenology, to the timing of weather, climate events. And even when to plant and harvest crops as well, of course, is a part of phenology, which is something that we do here. Where we have pretty dramatic changes in seasons, of course, from winter to spring. Deciding when is the right time to plant your crops obviously can be very important. Phenology is really a fundamental part of human life, and it's the way that we relate to nature, and it really has been for as long as human history has been around. And this is one reason these three things, essentially, phenology is linked to climate, that it's important for ecology, and that it's a part of everyday life, that so many groups are interested in tracking phenology and how it impacts climate change, how climate change impacts it, rather. And why this data that is collected in a lot of phenology monitoring programs is so valuable to scientists, to park managers, and to policymakers. IPCC, many of you have probably heard of by now. They've been around for a long time, at least since the early 2000s. And generally, they usually publish a report each year over the past 20 years or so. And phenology often makes it into those pages, one way or another. This was from a report a few years ago, where they specifically called out phenology as saying it's perhaps the simplest process in which to track changes in the ecology of species in response to climate change. So again, phenology is on the forefront of what a lot of groups are looking at as far as good ways to be able to track changes in climate. And today is a time of rapid change. There's no doubt about it. Things are changing, faster than they ever have, as far as modern humans really are concerned. Wasn't all that long ago. To us, it might seem like long ago in the mid 1800s, but really, as far as climate is concerned, it was just a drop in the bucket as far as time goes. Many of you may recognize that gentleman there. That is, of course, Henry David Thoreau. Was well known for trying to live deliberately, I think, as he put it. when he spent many years living at Walden Pond in a cabin there. And he actually was a really good monitor of phenology. He didn't probably realize that's not what he called it when he was doing this back then, but he kept pretty meticulous records of when things were leafing out and flowering. And it's actually now extremely important data that scientists can look at today to compare, where things are today, as opposed to where they were back in his time when he was down in the Concord, Massachusetts area. Boston University actually had several year-long study, trying to find the exact plants that Thoreau put in his journals and monitoring and seeing when they were leafing out and flowering out. And they found on average that when this is back in 2012 even, so now it's even been 10 years since then, that as of 2012, on average, things were leafing out or flowering out about 18 days earlier than they were in Thoreau's time. So, a pretty significant change for sure over 2 weeks earlier. I'd imagine now it's probably even more of a dramatic change than that. So, this is where phenological mismatches can happen. If things aren't changing at the same rates as species that interact together aren't doing it at the same time, which is obviously a big issue and a problem, if that continues to happen. And they also found that not all plants are responding the same way as well, too. Unfortunately, it seems that the invasive species and non-native species, we're looking at Japanese barberry here, actually respond more dramatically to these earlier warming temperatures. They take advantage of it better than the native species do. A lot of plants, and shrubs in the New England region and Northeast really need to be careful about leafing out too early, because as we just saw, last week, we had a late frost that actually did a lot of damage to a lot of things that actually did leaf out a little earlier, because we had that kind of really warm spell in March. I think it was March, late March, early April. Then it cooled off, pretty dramatically again. And again, we had that late frost, just last week that damaged a lot of our plants. So, it's a gamble when you leaf out early, and it doesn't always pay off. But researchers wanted to see, how native plants compared to some other invasive species plants can respond to a warming climate. So this is also seen people are doing the research in the Concord area of Massachusetts. They actually went out and collected about 50 tree and shrub species. Basically, they've snipped the twigs from dormant plants at that time that hadn't leafed out yet. They did it in midwinter. And then they brought those back to their lab and they put it in basically jars of water and, as an artificially warm climate that their lab provided. And they found that the ones that responded to it most dramatically were things like the invasive species, things like the Japanese barberry here, and Japanese knotweed is also another species that takes advantage of warming weather earlier. They found that it didn't happen as much. Leaf out requirements of many species is specific to those species, and they found that native species such as highbush blueberry and red maple, for example, they didn't respond as rapidly because they are kind of, for lack of a better word, pre-programmed to be cautious about leafing out too early or flowering out too early, because they can be damaged, by a late season frost. It's kind of, quote unquote, learned their lesson there. And part of, I guess, since now we're still, in the relative early stages of climate change, even though things are warming dramatically, we still do get these late season, changes in temperature and these late frosts. Just driving back and forth to work, I've noticed patches of Japanese knotweed that actually got hit pretty hard by that frost, really knocked them back pretty bad. So, the gamble right now for some of these invasive species is not, paying off as much as it might in, say, 10 years or 20 years or further down the line, when, these late season frosts are going to be a lot less common. And the ones that are best poised to take advantage of it, unfortunately, are the invasive species as it stands right now. So it's one of the other reasons why parks and other places are concerned about keeping their invasive species in check, because they are ones that most likely to take advantage of this in the future. So the bottom line really is that, of course, phenology is changing, that plants and animal species are responding in different ways to the changes in phenology and climate, and that the changes will have big implications for the plants and animals, and of course for us too, for people, and that we need more information. And this is where really kind of other groups come in, as far as nonprofits and national parks and citizen science as well, citizen scientists that help collect this information. The Northeast Temperate Network, we do have kind of our phenology monitoring protocol that was created early on during the early years of the program. And for several years, we've set up cameras in the park. Actually, this is a white wood aster that cameras are set up on to see when they are a late flowering wildflower in the forest. So I wanted to monitor those and see when those are flowering out. They put recorders out in the forest as well too. I don't think this is going to work. I don't think I'm going to try it, but I doubt it's going to play correctly. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but this is just a recording that was basically, it was started, we put it out, the recorders out in March, and we left them out there basically all through fall, through October, just to see when the earliest migrants were coming back, earliest bird migrants. Also, you could hear the amphibians when they started to sing too, the spring peepers and the wood frogs and the toads. So this is going to be a data that's again, very important as the climate continues to change, and to see how things have changed over time within the park here. And we also heavily rely on what's called the USA National Phenology Network. They've been around now for quite a while, probably at least 15 years or so. And this is one of those, kind of great things that the age of the internet allows for, in the sense that, everybody with a smartphone essentially can become a citizen scientist. And, you don't have to be a part of an official program. It's just something that you can do on your own. And these are just showing for this particular year when this was done, showing kind of clusters of parts of the country where people are making phenological observations. It's a really neat program. And it's something that I think Kyle's going to talk to you more about, but it's one of those programs that is not only helpful for the USA National Phenology Network, but a lot of people are looking at the data that's being collected, because again, it's not only just in North America, a lot of this is happening across the world. So and I think I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen at this point, and I think we can hand it on over to Kyle.
Yeah, all right. I can take over now, and I will share my screen as we focus on. Is we all good here? Just want to make sure.
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. So I'm going to talk about specifically what we're doing for phenology monitoring here at Marsh-Billings, as well as St. Gaudens National Historic Park. As you may or may not know, the natural resource team here at Marsh-Billings is also in charge of natural resources at St. Gaudens. And we plan on doing phenology monitoring at both parks, as they are fairly close to each other, but have enough of a different climate and ecohabitats that there will be differences, as well as different species that we will be monitoring for. So just a little bit of background, just covering, as Ed said, phenology is that study of recurring plant and animal life cycle events, or phenophases as they are called. The timing of these events are super critical for human life, as Ed mentioned as well, allergies, planting crops, things like that. Phenology requires regular observation and monitoring to provide data for changes in the area of your study. And here at Marsh-Billings, since we are a smaller park, our superpower, our strength will be the length of time. So we're aiming this to be a 10-year minimum program, so we can gather all of that reliable large data set that you would need to come to conclusions and things like that. And then as I just mentioned, NETN partnered with the National Phenology Network in 2009 to start phenology monitoring in those Northeast parks. So we have a few goals for our monitoring protocols here at the park. We want to provide insight. We want to provide insight into changing environments here at the park as climate change progresses and things like that. We want to know exactly how things are changing. We want to provide meaningful community science opportunities for local students, as part of my role here is engaging with local students. Getting them involved in projects here at the park. So this is one way that we are doing that. So the local high school students will be the ones responsible for a majority of the phenology monitoring data collection, which is really cool, giving them that chance to get hands-on with real world science. And then our last one, we just want to understand when things are happening in the park, because once we understand when things are happening in the park, we can better manage for things and events within the park. So a lot of our focus on natural resources here is on invasive species. So when we are phenology monitoring, we are notating when some invasive species are flowering, when it's easier to identify them, so we can then better manage for them and kind of reduce their impact on natural and native species. So when it comes to choosing our species here at the park, we have a lot of different curriculum that we need to focus on. The first of that being place-based. Place-based is this theory in education that the more local a species or more local connection that you can provide in the education setting, the more meaningful it will be. So by us choosing species here at the park that have big local impacts, those students will have a bigger connection to being able to identify and wanting to learn about those individual species. We need to make sure that these species are observable, so we don't want to choose species that are super rare in the park or not super easy to see. So like if you were to look at the list of bird species here at the park, you will see that there was a crested cara spotted here a few years ago. That is not a species we would want to observe because they're not regular. This is not their typical habitat, so they just wouldn't provide a good solid foundation for us making management decisions here at the park. So you just want to make sure that all of the species that we are chosen are reliably observable here at the park. So we are making the best decisions possible with the information that we can gather. We want to make sure that all of our species are identifiable. A lot of the natives up here and some of the invasives can be easily confused with each other. So we want to make sure that all of the individuals that we have chosen are easily identifiable to anybody, so that we are making decisions based on the right observations. Because if we were observing a plant and we got a whole bunch of data for the wrong individual, the wrong species, we could then make negative decisions that would do more harm than good to our local environment here. So we want to make sure that all of those aren't super easily identifiable and things like that. And then last but not least, we want to make this accessible to everybody. Everyone comes from different backgrounds. We have different mobilities, different accessibility issues. So we want to make sure that all of the individuals or the routes that we choose to walk are doable by a majority, if not everybody, at least portions of the routes. So that way everyone, no matter who you are, can get involved. I did say that students will be utilized for a majority of the gathered dataing, but we also want to potentially include people who visit the park on a daily basis. So having some of our interp rangers lead phenology hikes and things like that. So having a chance for everybody to get involved in this as well. So these are the plant species that we have chosen here between the two parks to monitor. So red maple, big common tree here that is easily identifiable based on red buds, red twigs, the leaves in the fall, and makes up a good percentage of the trees here in our forest. Hobblebush, another easily identifiable plant with its big massive buds and white flowers. all of our hobble bushes that are right next to the trail here at the park, so they're easily accessible, things like that. And they are some good spring ephemerals that will bloom early that allow students to see kind of that changing of phenophases. Up next is serviceberry, this stout tree with its bright white flowers and its multi-stem trunks. Again, easily identifiable. We have a pretty large one here at the park. It's like 45 feet tall, so which is very big for a serviceberry. So again, that easily identifiable individual. What's cool about serviceberry is they got their name from when back in the 1700s and 1600s, when the flowers would start blooming and things like that, that was a sign to the village that the ground was soft enough to bury people who had died over the winter, because they didn't have the tools or the means to be able to dig into the frozen ground here in the Northeast, which is pretty cool. Up next is common milkweed. This is a very important plant for a lot of pollinators and is very common in the fields here. So this is a very important species for us to monitor because it will provide us insights into the insect populations here at the park and if they're declining or increasing. Up next is sugar maple. Sugar maple is super important here in the Northeast with maple syrup. Once again, it makes up a high percentage of trees here, especially at Marsh-Billings. So that allows us to have lots of individuals to pick from and a way to connect those students to the local environment and economy and things like that. Up next is white wood aster. Again, this is one of those spring ephemeral plants that and through the summer that has these white flowers that is easily identifiable once they get them. It's a little harder in the wintertime, but a lot of our students will be observing in the shoulder seasons of spring and fall when these guys are still pretty identifiable. Again, this is one of those smaller plant species that we are able to identify and observe fairly easily here at the parks. And then at St. Gaudens, we are replacing serviceberry with American witch hazel, as there's a higher percentage of American witch hazel down there in New Hampshire rather than those serviceberry trees that you will find up here in Woodstock. And this is a very unique plant as it holds on to its flowers a long way through winter, so it will give those students an ability to observe flowers even in December, January, when they're getting out and observing, which is super cool. As for our animals, we have 8 species of animals that we are observing. Ovenbird is a pretty common warbler, forest warbler here in the Northeast that everybody knows the call of and can identify based on that sound. And it's a spring migrator, so it allows us to kind of learn when spring is occurring. As a lot of you if you have gotten out recently, they've probably returned here in the last 2 weeks. So we kind of can get a window of when things are arriving. Spring peepers, again, that kind of arrival of spring, they have a pretty easily identifiable call, so it's not confused with too many other things. This is probably the individual that will be hardest to identify for most people, is this Canadian tiger swallowtail, as they look very similar to eastern tiger swallowtails. But the biggest difference between the two is when they arrive. So you will see Canadian tiger swallowtails population peak in June, early July, whereas your eastern tiger swallowtails will be a little bit later in the year, peaking in August, early September. So even though they may look very similar to each other, there's just based on when you see it is a good way to identify which individual you are observing. And this allows us to kind of judge when our butterflies and our native pollinators are going through their life cycles. Up next is a bobolink. This was used as a presentation of training the students, so I figured I would throw in the female bird species, as male bobolinks are pretty easily identifiable, but these females can be a little bit more challenging looking, a lot like sparrows or other species of bird. Again, these are very reliable migrators in the early summer, late spring, so watching for their arrival and observing them through their nesting phase as they require these big open fields allows us to gain a good understanding of field health and forest health in the surrounding area. Red-winged blackbirds, this is an individual we will be observing at St. Gaudens only, as we don't have a lot of the required habitat here at Marsh-Billings for them to survive, but at St. Gaudens there's a lot of it with that marshland right along the Connecticut River. So this is that individual that we have replaced with bobolink, as we don't see very many bobolinks down at St. Gaudens. These guys are super early spring migrators. The males will migrate in early March, even late February if it's a warm year, to set up those breeding habitats before the females arrive a little bit later in the spring. So this is a very good sign of when spring is right around the corner is when we start seeing these guys show up. And you will notice that a lot of these individuals are very observable during the school year, as we were targeting allowing those students getting out and doing a lot of the legwork. Up next, we have that black-throated blue warbler. Again, a super iconic and easily identifiable species with its blue coloration, with its upward trill of a song. It's not confused by too many other things, maybe northern parula, but they do look very different from each other if you can get your eyes on the individual bird. Up next is a winter wren. Again, these are those super early spring migrants with their very long trill and song. So there isn't a whole lot of other birds that you can confuse them for when they are singing. And then last, we have that monarch, which is a super iconic individual species across the North America that we have seen decreases in population, especially along the West Coast. So by combining that monitoring of milkweed and monarchs, we'll be able to get a very good idea of population here in the park, frequency, and things like that. So here at the park, when we are actually gathering data in the field, we are utilizing with the app that the National Phenology Network has created, which is called Nature's Notebook. They have a website that you can input data, as well as a mobile app. And then we're allowing those students to use Merlin Bird ID with song and picture ID to assist them in the field with bird calls and things like that if they need it. Just having more resources to utilize and pull from. So these are some screenshots of what those apps look like. So you'll have like a list of species that you're observing, the locations of where you're observing, and then kind of this observed or not present. And it's very important when you're doing phenology monitoring to select not present, to say no, even if you didn't see it, because those no's provide us a very good window of accuracy for when these phenophases are occurring. If you were to say, the last time you were to say no to, let's say you saw an ovenbird in August, that was the last time you saw an ovenbird for the year, and you didn't input a no until you saw until you saw one in early May, late April, let's say, we will then know that looking back at the data that they left sometime around the end of August and got back sometime around the change of April to May, but we don't know exactly when. Whereas if you had put no every single week up until you saw the yes, we would know that, oh, they are now arriving sometime between April 30th and May 2nd. So that's a much tighter window for us to understand when these things are happening. So those no's are just as important as getting those yeses. And then that screenshot on the right is just an image of what that Merlin Bird ID app looks like. Is it records the bird songs and it looks at the images of that spectrogram, as the app itself is actually doing photo ID instead of sound ID, because photo ID is a lot less intensive on computing power than sound ID is. When observing plants, it can be very daunting when you step up to a big tree and you see thousands of leaves. So the way that MPN has done this is in these bins. So we have less than 3, 3 to 10, 11 to 100, 101 to 1,000, 1,001 to 10,000, and more than 10,000. And then they came up with these kind of word phrases that you can think to yourself as you are observing the plant. So if it's more than 10,000, it would take you a very long time to count each individual one. Whereas 101 to 1,000, you would describe as many. So on the left there, we can guesstimate that there's probably somewhere between 101 to 10,000 buds on that tree. As you can see that it has those 3 buds in that circle, and then you can multiply that circle across the entire tree to get a generic guesstimation of things. This is called the intensity of a phenophase. This isn't a required thing when you're entering data, but it is something that we would like to see, as it does provide us a good snapshot of that individual plant. And then for some of these, like with leaf, like foliage coverage, it does it in percentiles. Again, you'll just answer these few questions in a flowchart to kind of guesstimate where you are getting, where they are falling within these bins of percent coverage of leaf cover or flower cover or things like that. And then we had them identify birds by their calls. I don't think this will work, but these are just recordings of certain birds that they will be observing. So this first one was that bobolink with that R2D2 trill that everybody can, once they hear a couple of times, can identify. Then that black-throated blue warbler with their upwards trill. Then our red-winged blackbird, which with that harsh like scream, that harsh trill. Ovenbirds, with that teacher, 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 or pizza, 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 whichever mnemonic device you like to go with, that you can hear from, it seems like, anywhere in the forest. And then winter wrens with their super long call. When I was teaching this with the students, I pretty much, if you have a single bird calling for 10, 11, 12 seconds, there's a very good chance it's a winter wren, as not very many birds have single calls that are that long. And then there we go. That is everything that I have for here at the park. We have a few minutes here for questions if anybody would like to ask some questions.
Go ahead, Margot. I think you're muted. Feel free to type in the chat too, if you don't want to speak up. So Margot asked, why no rodent skiing monitor? Just saw chipmunk and thought it was rather late.
Yeah, we thought about mammals, but mammals are a lot less common. Even the really common ones like red squirrels and gray squirrels and eastern chipmunks are not as readily seen in the park unless you know where you're looking or the routes take you by like a squirrel midden or things like that. They can be included, and other locations do monitor chipmunks, as MPN has a very large range of species that they allow you to observe for. We just didn't decide to do that here, as we went along the lines of what can students reliably see every single time they're here, or reliably hear every single time that they're here. So that was kind of why we steered clear of those mammals, because they're not cited as often, even if they are common.
Well, we have a question from Lois. Can I arrange for my class to come to the park to learn how to be citizen scientists?
Yeah, definitely. We are in the process of hiring an education coordinator who that will be kind of their job, is working with local students and schools to get them out to the park. Currently, we have Kat Robbins in kind of filling in for that role, and we can get her info to you, and you can reach out to her, and then she'll get in contact with us about that.
And I also, to answer your other question, Lois, all of the Working Woodlands get recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, and I can put the link to the YouTube channel in the chat. And then how to get in touch with Kyle and Ed, if they're open to giving you their emails, that would be an option. And then Mary asks, in addition to staff doing the monitoring, how many members of the visiting public help you through the year with the observations?
So currently, we are in like a testing phase for the phenology monitoring, as we are just rebooting that, as when NPN and NETN originally partnered back in 2009, there was a little bit of monitoring done from like 2009 to 2011, but due to other things coming up, that kind of fell off the wayside. So this is kind of a way to revamp this project and get it going again, and kind of getting a really solid foundation for it to continue into the future. So we are currently looking and talking with our seasonal rangers and our volunteer coordinators about finding a way to get volunteers involved, visitors involved. So I think currently we're thinking about either doing a weekly or a monthly phenology hike with some of our rangers, who will meet a certain amount of visitors here at the park and then do a short little hike, talk about phenology, enter some data, things like that. So we're looking at potentially including 100 to 200 people, like visitors, public, a year in part of this process, as people who visit the park and are interested in joining and helping out.
I think people, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way the Nature's Notebook app works, I mean, they don't necessarily need to be part of a formal program if they wanted to monitor phenology in their backyard, or even in the park or whatever. I mean, people are able to do that, right?
Yeah, so on the National Phenology Network website, when you are signing up and creating an account, you will see the option to join a partner group. Marsh-Billings and St. Gaudens each have their own individual partner group that you can join and see the individuals that we are monitoring, their GPS locations on a map, things like that. So you can just have your own account, come out whenever you feel like it, and observe on your own. That's also definitely an option. We will probably, when we get everything finalized and nailed down, have like a protocol, a public-facing protocol on our website that you can go to, and it'll have pictures of the individuals, how to figure out if you're looking at the right individual, things like that. So kind of a simple startup guide of how to do it on your own.
Are there any other questions? Lewis says, have you seen this composer making music from bird calls?
No, but it sounds awesome. Definitely gonna check it out.
Yeah, very cool.
Same.
And Lois, I think that Kat Robbins' email was posted in the chat, and that's who you'll be reaching out to plan. Sure. Question about monitoring the aster. Why
Yes.
chose the aster?
Yeah, that's a good question. So aster was included in the original protocol for monitoring, and we wanted to stick as close to that original protocol with species. So that's kind of where we got a good majority of our species from, was that original list of species, because we do have data from 2009 to 2011, as Ed kind of mentioned. Having long-term older data is important for being able to tell when and how much things are changing. So that was kind of the thought process behind the aster and some of those other species, was to be able to identify some of those same individuals to see how things have changed in the last decade.
And I think the reason the program picked asters because they're trying to get species across a variety of seasons. So the wood aster tends to flower a little bit later in the season, as opposed to, like, one of the species that we also did was red maple, which is one of the earliest flowering plants, obviously a tree, but then wet wood aster usually August or so, most years starts flowering. So again, just to kind of get a broad swath of across the blooming year.
Anything else? All right, if we don't have any other questions, then I think we can end a couple minutes early. And if you think of anything else you want to know about later, feel free to email me or Kyle. And thank you all for coming. I hope to see you at future presentations.
Thanks, everybody.
And I can post my email in the chat for anyone who wants to reach out.